Lewis Hamilton has had a nightmare start to his valedictory campaign with Mercedes. So much so that you wouldn't blame him if he's counting down the days before he starts his new life as a Ferrari driver in 2025. It's been so bad, he rates it as worse not only than the previous 2 seasons under the current ground effect regulations, but also than the early stages of his infamous 2009 season with McLaren. Then, McLaren badly misjudged one of Formula One's major rules resets and started the season terribly. But that year, he at least was able to win races in the second half of the season, something that seems a very long way off for Mercedes in 2024. The results back up Hamilton's negativity. Statistically, this is the worst start to a Formula One season he has ever had in terms of results. He hasn't qualified higher than 8th, while his retirement with a loss of oil pressure in the Australian Grand Prix means his only tangible results are 7th in Bahrain and 9th in Saudi Arabia. That's the first time in his 18 seasons in F1 that Hamilton hasn't notched up a top 6 finish across the first 3 races, and only the second time he hasn't had at least one podium result. He's been outpaced by George Russell in all 3 qualifying sessions with an average deficit of 0.143 seconds. And Russell has finished ahead in the 2 races both drivers finished, taking 18 points to Hamilton's meagre 8. Despite those struggles early on in 2009, Hamilton was still performing well. He comprehensively outpaced teammate Heikki Kovalainen across the first 3 weekends, and even finished 3rd in the season-opening Australian Grand Prix, albeit only temporarily, as he was subsequently disqualified for lying to the stewards about the circumstances of passing Jarno Trulli's Toyota under the safety car. But so far this year, not only has Mercedes disappointed, but Hamilton has also underperformed. And that's a surprise given he was cautiously optimistic heading into the season, describing the Mercedes W15 as a great platform to build from, and a better starting place from the past 2 years. So why has that optimism turned to dejection across the first 3 races of the season? Mercedes has what is, on average, only the 5th quickest car so far in 2024. That disappointing pace is part of the reason why Hamilton has endured a difficult start to the season, but there's more to it than that, as proved by the fact Russell has comprehensively outperformed him so far. The talk in the early stages of the season was that big steps had been made in terms of the rear-end instability that was a weakness last year. Hamilton himself was confident, further boosted by getting a change he'd pushed for with the cockpit position moved rearwards by 10 centimetres. The Bahrain Grand Prix weekend was inconclusive given it's a track Mercedes wasn't confident would suit the car. Hamilton's race was then compromised by the cooling problems that led to both Mercedes drivers having to take it easy throughout. But in Saudi Arabia, things started to go wrong. He complained about the high-speed performance deficit. He described the first 2 qualifying sessions as horrendous, but things got worse in Australia, where he failed even to make Q3. That was thanks to a moment at the penultimate corner that turned an advantage of almost a 10th over Russell into a deficit that meant he qualified only 11th. Hamilton complained about the familiar problem of the car being inconsistent from session to session. No setup changes were made between FP3, in which the car performed well, and qualifying, but Hamilton found the car was suddenly on more of a knife edge. The race went well in the early stages, showing what he called okay but not special pace, and getting ahead of Fernando Alonso and Yuki Tsunoda. But he then suffered the engine failure on lap 16 while chasing Lance Stroll, who went on to finish 6th. Over the course of just 3 races, Hamilton's pre-season optimism has turned to disappointment and confusion with what's once again a capricious car. Expectations now are of a long, hard struggle ahead of Mercedes. If Hamilton is to salvage 2024 after his difficult start, Mercedes must turn things round, and fast. At the heart of its problems is the fact that the performance of the car in the real world does not correlate with its simulation tools. The problem is that while the car is pretty good in the slow and medium speed corners, the downforce predicted isn't being produced in a certain speed range in the fast stuff. That was exhibited by the fast sweeps from turn 6 to 10 in Saudi Arabia. There, the Mercedes was a painful 16 km/h slower than Red Bull at the apex of turn 7. There's every chance Mercedes can fix this problem without major changes to the car that would require waiting until next year. That's because it lies in the detail of the underfloor and the way the car works when close to the ground, but this has been a long-running problem for Mercedes. In 2022, struggles with bouncing and porpoising led Mercedes to overlook its rear-end instability problems. The car for 2023 was therefore a similar concept, but it turned out that Mercedes had been too conservative with conceiving the car to run at similar ride heights to the previous year. Others were able to run lower without suffering from porpoising and bouncing and produce more downforce, and consistently so. This year, Mercedes thought it had fixed all of that, but it still has a problem. We can't say exactly what it is because even Mercedes is struggling to understand that, but it is working hard to do so. Technical Director James Allison said that the car has a problem with performance being good in practice sessions, going into qualifying confident, but then losing performance. The one pattern the team has identified is that the competitiveness of the car drops when the track is warm. That might be part of the trouble, but the key will be understanding the correlation problems. As Allison says, there are differences in what it's seeing in simulation in the high to low speed balance compared to the real world. If Mercedes can get to the bottom of this problem, which in particular appears to be related to the ability to control the downforce produced at very low ride heights and therefore avoid the bouncing problems that have flared up at times this season, then it should be able to fix it with aerodynamic upgrades. But the question is whether it can do that and how quickly. Suzuka is up next, a track where Mercedes had big problems last year in the high-speed sweeps of the first sector. That was because of the struggle to produce the necessary downforce at high speed. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And that's what will be getting Hamilton down so much. While the Mercedes has improved this year and is a faster car, relatively speaking it hasn't gained ground, and there are still fundamental problems holding it back. So if Mercedes can't turn it round and Hamilton faces a season of battling perhaps for podiums on a good day, might he check out and his performances drop off more? After all, he's only human. Hamilton admits that the difficult start to the season after the high expectations has been tough on the spirit. And not only is he in a situation where he potentially has little to look forward to other than a season of toil in a cause that he won't be fighting for next year, but also he can see how big a step Ferrari has made since 2023. Ferrari has had clearly the second best car so far this season, and perhaps most encouragingly, the SF24 has not only been quick, but also consistent and appears to give its drivers confidence. That means there is realistic hope it's on a trajectory that could close the gap to Red Bull and even beat it on merit. That means Ferrari is doing everything Hamilton hoped Mercedes would do this year. However, Hamilton is a competitive character, and while there might come a point late in the season if there's nothing to fight for where subconsciously the edge comes off his performances, it's unlikely he's hit that point yet. He admitted that the cascading problems can mean you risk just going through the motions. However, he's also said that he's inspired to keep pushing through all this by the efforts put in by the people he works with. There are clear reasons for Hamilton's struggles to date, and it's hardly unusual for him to make his frustration and dissatisfaction clear out of the car when the season hasn't started well. We saw much the same in 2022 and 23 after all. And Hamilton performed well last season after a difficult start, coming close to finishing second in the World Championship, having also been outqualified by Russell in the first 3 races. It's not unusual for him to struggle with a car at the start of the season and then make gains. The only difference this time is he knows this is his final campaign for Mercedes. Hamilton said he's trying to keep things in perspective after the Australian Grand Prix, as things could be worse. He obviously wants to leave Mercedes on a high in his 12th and final season. He's had enormous success, winning 6 Drivers' Championships, and he headed into the season with the intention of doing everything he can for the team. Even if a World Championship bid is comprehensively out of the question, adding to his tally of 82 victories for Mercedes would at least allow him to sign off on a higher note than the previous 2 winless seasons. But whether Hamilton can do that depends on Mercedes getting on top of its car problems and making some big improvements. If this doesn't happen, then who could blame him if later in the season it becomes difficult to dig deep, when perhaps the most exciting challenge of his career lies around the corner at Ferrari? At least from his perspective, that means there is an end in sight to this recurring nightmare.